because we don't have that. We're in deep financial trouble here in South Africa, and I think instability will be an enemy of progress and growth rather than an ally.
Why are South Africa's coalitions so unstable, and how can these be stabilized? I posed this question to John Steenhuisen, leader of the DA, in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. You can watch the full episode by clicking on the link in the description below. Enjoy. So how do we stabilize these coalition governments? Because maybe the electorate is looking at all of this and thinking, sure, this is very volatile. I'm not sure that this is the way to go.
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say to that is, I mean, yes, it is volatile, but any new birth, has its tough times, and I think we are finding each other across the spectrum. But also, I mean, you mustn't forget, I think there's over 38 coalitions around the country, and the majority of them work perfectly fine. I mean, there's obviously ones where you have a specific dynamic, and yes, I think it has been unfortunate the manner in which some coalition partners have adopted in those particular coalition agreements. And I don't want to go back into the whole, the fact that when I sign a deal, I regard that deal as binding, and unless the deal is renegotiated, that you don't just change things on the whim. And I think that was very frustrating. I think that there are some of the parties in the coalition that need to decide what they want. And if I may direct myself particularly at a party like Action South Africa, I think there's a sense of schizophrenia that is set in there, where they don't know whether their primary job is to destroy the DA or it's to bring the ANC below 50%. And so you have this tension that then develops because they don't want to see the DA seem to be succeeding on one hand, but then they also don't want to be allowing the ANC on the other hand. And I think it leads to the schizophrenic behavior that we've seen even just yesterday, where when the court case that reinstated Mpopalatse was announced, they put out a statement saying the ball's in the DA's court now to reach out to the other parties. And that process had already begun. And then there was a statement saying, no, well, we're going into opposition and we're going to be on our own, to a position a few hours later saying, well, the DA must reach out. So it is a schizophrenia that is frustrating. Obviously, I believe that we need to have a greater level of political maturity to make these work. But as I said, I do think it is early days, and I think that coalitions 2.0 are already far better than the coalitions 1.0 that we had after the 2016 local government elections, where a number of lessons were learned. And so, I think that is going to be some growing pains, and parties are going to have to find each other. And I think there's going to have to be an element of far more political maturity going forward to make sure that we're able to demonstrate that these are viable alternatives to the one-party government.
Yeah, I often quote Antonio Gramsci on this show, where he said that the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. And in this interregnum, a variety of morbid symptoms appear. We certainly have a lot of morbid symptoms at the moment.
Yeah.
But the Action SA, if they were joining us today, would say, well, the DA is very arrogant in the way that it conducts itself in these coalition discussions. Do you think that's an unfair criticism?
I absolutely think it's an unfair criticism, and I think it's a very convenient scapegoat for you to do it. And obviously, the bigger party in a coalition is always going to be subject to that. The reality is there have been three major compromises, and I serve on the coalition oversight group where the leaders come together. There have been three major compromises that have had to be made over the course of the last 6 to 8 months. All three of those have come from the DA side. I don't think it's arrogant to expect partners who sign a deal with you on their own volition and under no duress whatsoever, to expect them to abide by that particular agreement. I think that's to be expected. I think it is arrogant to believe that you can just walk away from a deal that you signed a few months before, because now suddenly it no longer suits your narrative or what you want to achieve. So I reject the notion that the DA is arrogant. I do, however, think that there needs to be an understanding that in a coalition, yes, there are a number of players, but there are parties that have brought more seats to the table than others. And, it doesn't matter whether you're dealing with a CDU-led coalition in Germany or one of the others in the Nordic state. There is a bigger party always, and that party is entitled to, I believe, more say because they've brought more shares to the table. It's the same as a shareholders meeting for a corporate. A major shareholder has definitely got more say than a single shareholder. And I don't think it's arrogant to expect people to abide by their agreements. And I think there's been a lot of give and take, and I think that the DA has made a lot of concessions. And I think it's an unfair analysis to call us arrogant.
Right. You mentioned Germany, and they currently have the robots coalition, the traffic light coalition, as they would call it, the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and the Social Democrats. But now in Germany, they have thresholds. So you need, I think it's 5% of support in the Bundestag in order to have a seat there. But in South Africa, we have this plethora of small parties, and Helen Zille has been quite critical, saying that they are effectively kingmakers that can bring a whole coalition tumbling down, and that introduces the checkbook politics, as I think you've mentioned before. So, do you think that is something that would be suitable to the South African context? Or
I do think it's going to be critical as we go forward now and we move into a coalition environment. And a proportional representation system like South Africa will always ultimately end up in some coalition eventually. And I think we're now in that reality. I do think we should be looking at putting thresholds in for precisely those reasons, that you end up with a party that got 0.32% of the vote that can essentially decide whether a government falls or stands. And I don't think that is right. And I think that we should look at thresholds. We've proposed a threshold of between 1% to 2% in some private members' legislation that we're busy working on in Parliament, but also to look at ways in which we can facilitate coalitions in the legislative environment that we have at the moment. So, for instance, you've literally got 21 days after the election to elect the president. That's not enough time. I mean, look at that German example. I think it took 6 months to negotiate that coalition. And, I think that the system at the moment doesn't allow for a proper and considered coalition negotiation to take place and for an agreement to come out. And I think it's going to cause some rush things. So thresholds and I think some legislative changes are going to be required to facilitate healthier, more stable coalitions going forward.
And might not that risk violating the principle of proportionality? I mean, the Constitution does say proportional in general, but there could be a criticism there that might undermine the votes that have been cast to those small parties.
Yeah, well, I would think that you're going to lose on the swings and gain on the roundabouts. So I think there will be a price to pay for having thresholds, but I think that the benefits, will outweigh any of those particular costs. And I mean, there's some places that have thresholds of up to 8 to 10%. I don't think it's unrealistic to expect somebody who could potentially be a party that ends up being in government to have at least 1% of the vote in order to reflect that. So I think there will be definitely some constraints on absolute proportionality, but I think the long-term benefits of the stability that it will bring, particularly when it comes to national and provincial government, I think is important. And I think that's something we mustn't lose sight of. Yes, the instability in Joburg is terrible, but can you imagine if that was the finance minister that fell and in the midst of us trying to attract investment into South Africa and some small party pulled out of government and collapsed the entire government, and now you're trying to rescue things at a national level. I think that it's not something that our economic situation could afford at this particular juncture. So I do think we need to find a way to stabilize it at a national level so that we prevent us ending up in a situation like Italy where the government changes more often than the tide. I think they've got the luxury of having a far more advanced economy. and a growing economy. We don't have that. We're in deep financial trouble here in South Africa, and I think instability will be an enemy of progress and growth rather than an ally.
Thanks for watching. Let's hand over to you, our audience. Do you think South Africa's coalition governments can be stabilized? Are they a viable alternative to the ANC? Leave your thoughts down in the comment section. Also, if you enjoyed this analysis, you might want to check out the full-length interview. That's linked over here. You can also subscribe to my other channel. That's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.